Welcome to my podcast. I'm sitting outside Highclere Castle on the lawns, again under the shade of an evergreen oak tree. It is the most beautiful day. I can certainly hear some birds, so you may well do so also during the podcast. And I suspect we might also hear the odd plane because it is such a beautiful day and I would suspect perfect for flying. And flying is what we're going to be talking about today. My next guest is a remarkable man who's become an amazing friend, Steve Bohill-Smith. He began his life with BA flying Concorde, and he's moved into more vintage airplanes. There's nothing he doesn't know about planes. And we have begun to share a love of early flying, planes, and a love of the skies. Isn't that right, Steve?
Yes, you've been up in the Tiger Moth, haven't you? Over Highclere Castle, three of us in formation, so you know what flying in a vintage aeroplane's like.
Yes, I have to say I'm not that good on heights, so I was doing my yoga breathing, but then I really did enjoy it when I was up there. It is the most extraordinary sensation. I met you first of all on an extraordinary day in September 2010, one which in my memories will be one of the most special days in my life, and it was to celebrate the centenary of the first flight of Geoffrey de Havilland from Highclere Castle, and it was actually 2 miles, I suppose, south of the castle from Beacon Hill. And this amazing man who became such a legend in the history of early aviation in England, I couldn't believe when I realised he'd made his first flight from Highclere. It's such an honour, and that's where I think I met you first of all.
I had been interested in de Havilland for a long time, and I didn't actually know either that the field that he'd chosen to do his first flight was actually at Highclere Castle. And on the 100th anniversary, he first flew in 1910. He flew 100 years ago when we met, and the Moth Club, they had organised a sort of centenary do, and you allowed all these moths to fly into Seven Barrows Field. And the weather was superb.
It was misty to start with.
Well,
my goodness.
Yes.
Hot.
But you'd rolled a strip, I think it was linseed, in the field up until about 3 days before. The crop was harvested and then there was a strip rolled, and I think we got about 85 various types of de Havilland moths landing in the field, and it was quite a sight.
It was an amazing... My husband was so happy because Geordie was running around seeing who he could get a flight off. So he was running around and he'd come back like a boy and so happy. And Clover saying, oh God, he's going to take me up. So he just loved it. And I had my son Eddie out with his school, and it was such a magic day to introduce these young children of 8 or 9 to what all the pilots were doing. And there was a huge bicycle, and there was tents, and there was burgers and food, and It was just extraordinary.
And of course there's a memorial stone in the field which actually says this: at this site, Geoffrey de Havilland, along with his engineer, he actually did his first flight from the field. So there's a commemorative stone in the field marking the spot.
And that really began my journey in trying to discover and explore and find out about Geoffrey de Havilland. And it turns out that his father was a rector at Cruxeaston, I think, which is just above the field he took off from, 2 miles away. And he had asked the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, who was the one who discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun, if he could use the field because there was a great big shed which had been used already by
Brabazon,
who became Lord Brabazon, and he took over this extraordinary shed and he made his plane in there from piano wire, and I don't know, what were the wings made of?
He was into engineering from an early age. His father was the vicar, so he wanted for Geoffrey to go into the church, but he wasn't having any of that, so he was interested in cars, aeroplanes. And then when the early aeroplanes started flying in Europe, mainly in France, I think Brabazon's aeroplane was a French design, a Farman, And he actually asked if he could keep it in the shed at Seven Barrows Field.
Which is why I think Voisin, who was part of the French aeronautical world, came and stayed here.
Yeah.
And I presume that was when Brabazon stayed here as well. And so these early aviators were staying in this castle, and it led to so much for the importance of the future world.
In those days, of course, it was all just wood, piano wire,
Canvas
sort of fabric. His wife spent hours and hours and hours in a workshop in Fulham, Boswell Street, when they were actually designing the aeroplane and putting it all together. She actually did all the sort of sewing on this little sewing machine, one of the treadle ones.
And the bravery and the courage, I mean, because he'd never seen a plane fly.
No. And the first design, I must admit, it did look like a sort of supermarket trolley with too many wheels and an elevator on the front and an elevator on the back, and this little 40 horsepower engine, which he actually designed, the Iris engine, and it had two propellers with bevel gears with this little engine. And I thought, wow, that was risking it to try and get that to fly. And in fact, he didn't. He actually got it off the ground. He became very impatient with his runs down the field, and it didn't seem to want to fly. And then he pulled back, and the thing actually rose up into the air, and it stalled, and then the wings folded, and it came down in a big heap of wire and broken fabric. They pulled it back into the hangar, they salvaged the engine, and then for another year, that was 1909, and it took another year to design a new, better aeroplane, and he successfully flew at Seven Barrows in 1910. No seatbelts. Just sat there.
No parachutes, no nothing. And I think, if I remember rightly, he took his wife and his baby son up in it too.
Yes, he managed to. I mean, the story goes at first he was doing these little runs down the field, and they were getting up. Of course, there was no instruments. He didn't know how fast he was going, so there was no altimeter or an airspeed indicator or anything like that. He had to do it by feel. And after a while, quite a few of these little sort of runs down the field, he said to Frank Hurl, his engineer, I think I was nearly flying on that last run. The bumps stopped. As he was going across the grass, they stopped. And so he said, I want you to go and lie in the field, and I'll go past you, and I want you to see if there's any daylight between the wheels and the grass. And he went roaring off down the field. Well, roaring off, he got up to about 35 miles an hour, we think, and he just eased it off, and then he stopped. Frank Hurl came running up, was sort of just waving his arms around and said, you were actually off the ground, just Amazing. A couple of inches. And of course then they knew that if they were a couple of inches off the ground, they could go much higher. And then after a while of doing that, he bit the bullet and was very brave in committing to going straight ahead so that he couldn't land in the field, going over the hedge and the little road, which is now the A34, and the trees, and then doing his first turn. And he'd never flown before, so he then had to turn the aircraft round, went on a sort of circuit, turned it again, and then came in for his first real landing. That was the moment that was, I think, the bravest part, really.
Completely extraordinary. I would absolutely agree with
you.
Oh,
and after he'd done that a few times, he said to Frank Hurl, would you like to come up? And of course he said he would, and they put another little seat in the aeroplane, and he took Frank Hurl up. And then he asked his wife, who had just had a baby actually, he was only about 8 months old, if she would like to go up, and she went up with him with the baby.
I know, I just can never get over that. You know, it's an extraordinary world. I mean, talk about risk, but it was planned risk, and by then he knew a little bit more about what he was doing. And you're right, if he could go 2 inches up, he could go 200 feet up.
Yeah.
But that's a very different world, because having met you from those circumstances, we then got to know, and you've come and had lunch with your lovely wife Maureen quite a few times. And because the other side of your world is the fact that you flew for British Airways and of course flew Concorde. And when we went to Duxford, when we were doing some filming for the BBC, you took me and we sat in the Concorde cockpit of the Concorde, that is at RAF Duxford, and I learnt a little bit more about your extraordinary world and this camaraderie and band of Concorde pilots who really are sort of still heroes today, I think. So there we go, you're a hero too.
Well, I was in British Airways. It's a big corporation. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, seniority-wise. It was a very small fleet. There was only around 18 crews, 7 aeroplanes. The course, when I got selected to go onto the course, I thought, well, this is going to be pretty hard work. And it was 6 months out of my life with classroom, exams, 5 week simulator, and then we actually got the chance to fly it for the first time up at Prestwick in Scotland. And I must admit, walking out to that aeroplane, that beautiful aeroplane, for the first time and thinking to myself, wow, I am actually going to fly this, was quite something. And what was really funny, we had these Concorde engineers that accompanied us up there to change, when we wore the tyres out, when we were doing all these circuits and bumps, they'd change tyres and look after the aeroplane. They'd actually put an L plate on the nose wheel and taped it on the nose wheel. And I've got a photograph of me standing next to the aeroplane with the L plate, learner's plate. And they said, you just look after her, don't you bend anything, So that was the sort of commitment that people had to the aircraft.
Yeah. How long did you fly Concorde for in the end?
I was on it for around 7 years as a first officer. And then you had to go off and fly as a commander, as a captain in something else before you could then go back onto the Concorde. But unfortunately, my seniority wasn't sufficient for me to go back in the left-hand seat. But those 6 or 7 years that I was on it was just the most fantastic time that I've had in my aviation career.
And I'll never forget going to RAF Duxford, which is by Cambridge. We were going there as part of the story of aviation here, which we can come back to. Having done our kind of dutiful bit with the filming, but we then went through to where Concorde was and climbed up in to have a look at it, and then you blagged your way into the cockpit so we could both sit there very kindly. It was extraordinary just sitting in this beautiful plane. I mean, what a piece of history, what a piece of engineering. I don't know why we didn't go on from there in some ways, because it was such a beautiful plane and what it achieved was amazing. But what was it like for you to sit back in the plane again?
Well, it was amazing. It's always, when I see it, I think, wow, that is just so futuristic. The shape, the advance in aerodynamics to get that thing flying. Mach 2, twice the speed of sound, 60,000 feet, first class service, just over 3 hours to New York from London. It was just such an advance in air travel.
I sadly have never been in Concorde apart from in RAF Duxford, but when you were on the runway about to take off, tell me what those first few minutes was like.
Well, there's 3 of us in the cockpit. There's the captain, first officer and a flight engineer. We've had to do all the checks meticulously, and when you line up and the air traffic control says Speedbird Concorde 1 clear for departure, everybody is sitting there knowing the next few seconds are going to be extremely exciting, and it's all done to the second. So when you say 3, 2, 1 now, you put the throttles forward. Everything is programmed to wind up at a set rate, at a certain power. The afterburners light, 4 afterburners, and that's when you really get the punch in the back of the seat. The acceleration, the first 10 seconds of acceleration is pretty spectacular, and the speed builds up very, very quickly. Rotation is the speed that we use to start pulling back on the aircraft control to rotate the aircraft to its takeoff angle, and by then you're doing 230 miles an hour. And that's taken only a matter of 20 seconds or so. And by the time you've got the gear up, you're doing nearly 280 miles an hour. And so the acceleration is quite spectacular. And the noise is spectacular. I know people don't like noise, but 2 Concorde departures a day weren't too bad. Everybody stopped and looked at it as it went over.
I remember stopping and looking as it went over, and we used to spend some of our holidays in Cornwall, and we probably couldn't see it, but we always know that Concorde at some point was flying from England to America. And it was incredibly romantic, and it was you felt very proud of the engineering and the achievement, actually. Extraordinary times. We were actually at RAF Duxford to film the B-17, weren't we, which is part of the story of flying here, because after the Geoffrey de Havilland and the tiger moths and developing friendship from your and my side, I had then realised that there was the remains of a B-17 which had crashed into the hills behind Highclere at the end of World War II. Was just trying to finish my book about World War II at Highclere. I had 2 weeks to go, and I could feel this new story coming up towards me, completely panicked. And it became an epilogue to that. And I remember standing up where the B-17 went down with Eddie Hughes, our head keeper, who told me the story, thinking, why didn't I know this before? Geordie, who didn't seem to know it at all, why didn't you tell me about what you didn't know? So that was when I then contacted you and said, Steve, I think I've got a B-17 here. Would you help me find it? And how can we go about this? Just one of those mad calls through. You said you thought you knew a metal detectorist, someone with a metal detector who was brilliant, and you'd met him through your pub, the Flower Pots. Everything seems to happen at the Flower Pots pub. Although Paul, as it turns out, doesn't drink, so by complete chance he went to a pub as a non-drinker. He happened to be a metal detector, and he happened to know you, who I think does have the odd beer or glass of wine, as I do. And that was really the beginning of a story. And I remember you both coming up here to begin to try to find where it was and going up to the hill. And then do you want to carry on from there?
Well, I'd done quite a lot of research when you told me about it, and it was actually quite hard to find where the crash site was, because the crash reports had spelt Sidown Hill wrong,
yes,
incorrectly, and then I got onto the RAF museum and they came back with the date, and then we found the registration number, the flight number, and the markings. And the aeroplane was called Fort Worth Jailhouse. You know how the Americans put all that nose art on their aeroplanes. Then we found out a location, and we had to get permission from the Ministry of Defence to do the search. And we went up there, and I remember it was quite a gusty, cloudy sort of day. Paul wasn't quite sure what he was expected to find, and we walked through the stinging nettles and the undergrowth, and he said, well, what are we looking for? And I was under a big yew tree, and I looked down. I nearly tripped over, actually, and there was a big chunk of the fuselage skin of the aircraft lying there, and it had been there since it had crashed in 1945, so we knew we were pretty close. And the guys, it was a nasty day, there was low cloud, rain, low visibility, and they were trying to get into Greenham Common, and they came out of the cloud, circled round the castle a couple of times. Gamekeepers heard it. They went off in a southerly direction. Any other direction they would have missed the hill, and they just clipped the trees on the top. And then it came down and it shattered into thousands of pieces. One survivor. So that was an interesting story in itself. And then, of course, we knew we were roughly in that sort of area, and we started finding small pieces, fragments of the aircraft, plexiglass from the turrets. We even found a couple of instruments, because the aeroplane, the main parts of it had been cleared away after the event by the United States authorities.
But there was quite a lot left. I mean, we found quite a lot, and I have quite a lot on pallets up in the farm, actually, where it's safe. And then I remember after that, we then began to realise, because one of the other keepers said, there's another plane in the woods over there. There's the remnants of them springing up everywhere. The next plane we went on the search for was a P-38. And it was you, I and Paul up in my little old Mitzi car, which I'm glad to say I still have. And you and I were in the front and Paul in the back. And he was so excited. We stopped the car. He got out. And I'll never forget it. He was running towards the edge of the wood, and he was so excited he didn't see some barbed wire in the grass, so he fell over, and the only thing he heard was you and I crying with laughter as we watched him bounce.
Well, it was one of the funniest things I've ever seen. He fell down like a sack of potatoes. And,
there wasn't much sympathy, was there?
Yeah.
He was luckily completely fine, and what was even funnier was it was the wrong glade, so we had to get back in the car.
You know, people don't go through the woods up there very often. Perhaps the odd beater in the season, but we did find a very large piece of machinery just lying there, all covered in moss.
Yes.
And we identified it as a turbocharger from one of the two engines. So
it's amazing. So we found quite a lot of the P-38, and then we ended up finding the story. And I remember I shared that particular story on my blog, and what was extraordinary was it was the man who so sadly died in 1944 was Lieutenant D. Stewart, and one of his relatives was looking for him for his story because nobody knew what happened to so many of these men. How did their lives end? Where could they be mourned? And she contacted us, Jessica Rasmussen, and she then came over. And I know you remember the day, and Christine Dale, our vicar, we about 8 or 9 of us went up there, and we held a service around a cross we'd had made. And, you know, his family had asked us what to put on it, told us what to put on it, they'd like on it. Do you remember then Jessica and her son, who was about 16, said, could they sing a hymn? And pitch perfect in this glade in the woods with bluebells and birds in the trees, they sang this hymn, and I don't think many of us weren't crying. Actually, it was extraordinary.
What was amazing is they got their mobile phones out and they had the words all on their mobile phone, and they both sang this pitch perfect hymn. Beautiful. And it was just a very touching moment.
It was so extraordinary, and I think we've then Paul Mack's been amazing because we've now got where all the different crash sites, there was 2 mosquitoes at Lysander, they're all now at least marked by a cross so that people know what's happened. And that has led to the creation of a statue remembering the airmen who fell here, and I suppose remembering the airmen wherever they fell in the Second World War, because so many of them fell far beyond where we know what happened to them, whether it's location or time. There was so much catastrophe and grief. You couldn't sort of remember each person individually. And then contacting the American families, which you and Paul have been so instrumental in doing, and now with Jeff Pickett and all of our friends in America, it's been such a moving journey. And the letters we've found and the diaries and the people we've gathered together just to say thank you. It's been an extraordinary journey, hasn't it, actually?
Well, meeting the families, I think, really puts it all into perspective. It sort of makes it much more personal when you meet the families of some of the crew that perished up there. And of course one did survive for a short while. Well, he was very badly injured, but he actually visited Highclere in the 1980s, came over, and the gamekeepers took him up to see the crash site. So that was quite a story in itself.
I know.
Just one person. And he was the radio officer. And one of the things we did find in the grass up there was the radio Morse code key. So he would have been operating that Morse code key while he was on the aeroplane. So that all brought it home, quite a lot, really.
It has, and it's so. I think it was a letter about William Dutton, one of the young men who died, which it was from a school friend to William Dutton's father, saying, wherever he died, because none of his family knew where he died in England, the ground will be made that much richer by his blood. I mean, it's extraordinary things that we've found from the diaries and the letters, and we do know now where he died. And then what's been marvellous is because they died all in the hills, where in different crash sites, like in so much of this country, or at sea, to have actually created the statue of the airman in the lawns not far from the castle, so that all the visitors, if they so wish, can go and have a look, sit there, reflect, remember. And I'd like to actually copy some of the letters and the diaries and make a little table which people can open and read some of the letters and diaries and put them back again. So many people go to see it that I think I need some more benches.
Yes. Well, the idea of the benches in the shape of the P-38 tailplanes I thought was a brilliant idea, and using the cedar tree, because the cedar must have been 200 years old. The sculptor, I thought, did a brilliant job. It is quite an impressive statue, and because
it's very human, though, isn't it? You can hold his hand.
Yeah, because a lot of the air crew that were involved here came from all around the world, because it wasn't just Americans and British, it was New Zealand and Canadians as well. We couldn't actually have, say, an RAF person in as a statue in RAF uniform. We had to do a sort of composite, and I think it worked quite well. And he's turning slightly and looking back at the castle. It looks as though he's turning to his family to say goodbye. Which I thought was really a nice idea.
I ended up practising. Simon O'Rourke, the wood sculptor I'd met at a Christmas fair, I'd lost his card, and my desks are clearly very untidy because it took me about 2 years to find it, by which time the tree had fallen down and the idea had come to mind. And I asked him here for tea or coffee when we were open to the public. And there was one of our young chaps, interns, working in the tea rooms, and I said, "Excuse me, would you mind being a model for us?" So I said, "Right, if you can turn around then, I want you to look back to say goodbye to us, and I want you to be my model, and you've got a sack to balance on here." He really got into it, actually. We did it for about half an hour, but it was quite fun, and I'm so happy with it, and I think it means a huge amount to the current families today by way of remembering what their ancestors did and saying thank you to them. So it's become a good part of Highclere, and he's surrounded by flowers and beautiful views, and his body is facing the hills into which so many of the planes crashed, but he's looking around at all of us. So it's just a small way, and the cedar, when Simon cut it, was extraordinary. The smell and the scent of the cedar, and it's going to last for hundreds of years, so it'll be here for a long time. Might even outlive the castle.
A lot of people say, why were there so many crashes around Highclere? But of course, towards the end of the war, the Second World War, everything was building up towards going back
D-Day
over for D-Day.
Yes.
And so there were literally hundreds and hundreds of aircraft being brought over from the States, lots of airfields around the local area, and there was a sort of like a bombing range, a practice bombing range on the other side of the hill where the Mosquitoes incidents happened. So there were airfields all around here, and the history of the sort of air crashes just in Hampshire and Berkshire are just amazing. And the B-17, it makes it more poignant because the crash was only 3 days before the end of the war, VE Day, and just 3 days. And the crew had done their 30 missions, so they should have really have gone home.
I know.
So.
It's this tragedy of war, isn't it? It's the endless accidents. But in some ways that leads us through, because you and all your extraordinary Tiger Moth comrades have been such a support for the different events we've had to remember the outbreak of the First World War, commemorate it and raise money. And then we did the end of the First World War, 2018, from 1918 to 2018, although we chose September when the weather was better. And that was an extraordinary weekend. We actually had the red arrows. My goodness, we had so much here. It was, again, a weekend to remember. But the point of it is to look at history and share it, but to raise money for those who serve and those who save today. And I know we were going to do a commemoration of VE Day, which has obviously passed us by in a much quieter way. And what we were going to put on, we have shelved, although we've tried to postpone it, Steve, just to see if in October the 10th, when I had scheduled a history festival, then in fact we used the Saturday to look back at VE Day, to think about those who serve and saved, and again try to figure out how to raise money for those in that position today, to look to the skies, to the Tiger Moths, and to see what other planes we could bring in, some speakers, to dress some of the castle for the Second World War. And I'm looking forward to that, because I think in today's world we'll have some people here, but not the thousands we've had in the past. But of course we can now use the social media and the virtual filming that we've been doing and the way we've shared Highclere virtually to perhaps share it in a bigger way. I mean, it would be a good fun thing to do, and all the Concorde pilots, it would be lovely if I could welcome some of them back here to talk about what they did, and then again film it and share it. It'd be a great thing to do, Steve, because it was such an extraordinary band of brothers, of men who did that.
We had a lady co-pilot as well.
Well, it'd be lovely to gather them back over that weekend and just use it as a focal point to think about positive moments. I think it's been a really tough couple of months during the lockdown, to say the least, and it's led people to reevaluate perhaps their lives, and it's definitely led to hardship and struggle, and for some people to great grief. But I'd like to move past that a little bit and think how we can offer different experiences, opportunities, or things to see and watch. It'd be nice to have a Chinook again.
I'm sure we will.
Steve, thank you so much for joining me today. I have really enjoyed it, and I'm sure those who are listening might have as well. Thank you, Steve.
Pleasure.
Hello, this is Lady Carnarvon, and just to say, please do subscribe to this podcast. Then you can be first on the list every time it comes out.